I wanted to do a little bit to encourage continuity between our selfie discussion and the selfies that were posted, and thinking about how that connects to the Marshall McLuhan article that we're reading, and sort of talking about media ecology. So, one of the things that I think is really interesting about this particular transition is that what we did at the very beginning of the class is that everyone sort of posted a selfie and kind of described it a little bit. We also had some assigned readings where we were thinking about the evolution of photography, but also like thinking about what a selfie is and sort of like what's happening here. And one of the things that we sort of read about is this sort of transition between photography as a medium that really sort of is purely documentary, and also mostly for like a sort of really narrow audience, unless it's like a professional kind of format. And then a shift between photography that is much more communicative, and also, it has sort of like a like, it can have like a, even if it's for like a slightly wider audience, it just tends to be more communicative than other kinds of things. So one of the questions that I want to talk, sort of highlight two things in this video. The first is that, well, what's communicated by a selfie? And I think it's really interesting. Like, I loved going through everyone's videos or like everyone's selfies and like listening to what they had to say about them. Because that's sort of like, there's something that's kind of interesting and illustrative about the individual and the moment that's sort of like documented in the figure. But it's also the case that it's kind of fun to think about, like, well, if you look at the set of selfies, like if you look at everybody's picture, right? Like, what does it say about the students of the class, or selfies for the students in the class, right? So like it's illustrative and communicative of sort of like a broader phenomenon as well. So as we're connecting this to sort of Marshall McLuhan, I think it's really interesting to think about this shift in the sort of function and meaning of a photograph, right? One of the things that I think is a very subtle point about what Marshall McLuhan thinks, and this is probably, like, I'm only really capable of teasing this out because I've read a lot of Marshall McLuhan, and I've talked a lot about him with other people who sort of study a lot more than I do with what he wants to say. And one of the things that they're interested in is that they have this sense that for any kind of technology or any kind of like act involving technology, it's never just about the sort of act of taking a photograph or the act of, like using a particular kind of technology. It's about what it means to the person who's doing it, and also how it fits in with a sort of broader sense of like what other people are doing with it, right? So it like fits into this kind of whole. And so it's really interesting to see people kind of playing around with different kinds of technologies, and thinking about the ways in which selfies can be even like kind of subversive. So I thought the best example of this, actually, in a way, I thought was it was in the Wax Museum with Matthew McConaughey, right? And there's like he's doing his like smirk, and then that's like being imitated. But it's so great because we have this practice of like running into celebrities, like in different kinds of like you go to a restaurant and all of a sudden you run into a celebrity, and so everybody like takes a selfie, right? Like, oh, and so there's this practice of taking selfies with celebrities. So it's so interesting, and to think about the sort of subtle subversions of that are happening when you take a selfie with a wax mannequin, right? And that's what you post to social media, right? Like that ends up being this kind of like interesting kind of thing where you might interpret that in a lot of different ways, and you probably interpret it in different ways because it also like occurs in this context of sort of taking like selfies with celebrities. So what you have, I think, with selfies is always this kind of like multiple layers of meaning. And I think that's something that's sort of like really interesting about digital culture. But I do think it's actually an important thing about McLuhan is that he's interested in the effects of certain kinds of technology. And he's pretty explicit in some of his other works about the ways in which those effects are actually dictated by this like culture at large and not necessarily only about like individual acts. So there's like a dynamic between the way we use technology and how it's received and then how we decide to use it, right? So there's like a nice little feedback loop there. And so I think that's just like really interesting because there's this like really, in some sense, kind of simple, basic thing that we do, or some of us do. I mean, I don't actually post a lot of selfies either. I had to dig around. I had to use one from last year because I don't actually post selfies very often. But that's kind of interesting in itself too, right? Because you're thinking about like, well, who partakes in this practice and why? And you know, it can be different for individuals too, and the ways in which it's different sort of kind of subtly changes the contours of what the practice means. So these are the kinds of things that we're going to be exploring as we go on. And I think it's really interesting to think about like, you know, if we're thinking about McLuhan, right? He's like, well, like he sort of talks in some sense as if like it's just the medium that really affects the message. But I think if we think about selfies, you can see that it's more, what he means by that is there's this like dynamic interplay between the medium and the way that it's used. And so I just kind of wanted to flag that and also just kind of ask you, like, you know, like looking through everybody's selfies, what were some of the things that stood out to you, not about like individual selfies, but about like the group of selfies as a whole?